Hello, fifth graders, and welcome to your language arts lesson for today. Before we get started, our usual, you will need your language arts binder, your language arts materials packet, and a pencil. If you need to pause and go get any of those things, go ahead and do so now. The first thing that we're going to talk about, fifth graders, is the homework that you had. So remember, for your homework, you were supposed to be reading through the story about Perseus and identifying the moment of foreshadowing, and then when that was foreshadowing was fulfilled, meaning when it came true or when it happened. So if you also watched the second video that I posted where I read aloud, you might have gotten some hints from me as I was reading the story to you. But I gave feedback on your forms. And then fifth graders, it's just good to know always that when I give homework on Google Forms, I often will have a key available for you to kind of see how you did. But know that I always go in and read short answer, right? Any key for short answer is not going to match usually exactly whatever you type in, because if there's like a capital letter or a space or punctuation that's different, it'll mark it as wrong. And sometimes there might be more than one possible right answer. So just know that anytime you guys complete homework on a Google form, I always go in and read, and I always will give you feedback. So you don't need to get stressed if you get something back that makes it seem like you got everything wrong. I'll always look and then I'll tell you. I mean, maybe you did, and then I'll kind of work with you with that, but also know that sometimes it just will look a certain way but not be actually true. So your foreshadowing quote. We should have had this quote here, which says, an oracle told him that he would die by the hand of his daughter's son. Right? This is our hint from the author, and really the author also our hint from the oracle of something that will happen later in the story. So this is kind of like a prophecy, which we talked about. And then the moment it's fulfilled, I picked this one. You probably could have also picked the quote right afterwards. But one day, a sudden gust of wind changed the course of a discus he had thrown, and it killed an old man. You could also have had maybe the next sentence, which said, who could it have been but his grandfather Acrisius, right? So this is the moment when we see that foreshadowing, that prophecy came true, okay? Always be checking that homework for feedback, comments. Sometimes I'm asking you to make corrections, so it's just good to continue to read. And sometimes I'm just telling you what a great job you did too, which is always nice to read when you've done a great job at something. So, okay, fifth graders, we do have a little bit of new information today, but I want to remind you of this important date, literary devices test. So our first test covering literary devices is going to occur on Friday, September 11th. And as you may or may not know, that's tomorrow. We have our first test tomorrow. So to remind you, we have a study guide. It should still be in your language arts packet, materials packet. So remember the things that you'll need to know. You'll need to be able to match all of these terms to these definitions. So I would consider making flashcards in order to study these terms, okay? And actually you may already have flashcards of these from when this was your homework to study before, okay? In addition, all of these are the 5 literary devices that we will have learned by the end of today. Our last one is today. So studying these, you need to be able to match these to their definitions. Or select from multiple choice potentially. Okay, so we need to make sure that you're studying these, making flashcards of these, and studying these flashcards. Okay, and then remember, I am going to ask you to do 2 more things. I'm going to give you some pieces of textual evidence from a story that you've read, and I'm going to ask you to tell me, this piece of evidence is the setting, this is the rising action, this is the climax, this is the falling action, and this is the resolution. So you're going to have to match that. And then finally, I'm going to ask you to identify a mood from a passage of a story that we've read, and then pick textual evidence that supports the mood, which is very much like the homework that you did last week on Thursday, a week ago today. So that same idea, when we read Oliver Hyde and we picked a mood and supported it with textual evidence, I'm going to ask you to do something very similar on the test, okay? So that is your homework tonight, is to be studying for this test that is happening tomorrow. If you have questions about that, please, please, please make sure to ask me questions, okay? So for today, our objective is introducing our final literary device, which is this word hubris. It's a Greek word, so say hubris, fifth graders. Hubris. So we're going to be taking notes about this word hubris. So you'll need your literary devices, hubris. It's a half sheet of paper. You're also going to need this sheet of paper, which has the story of Icarus and Narcissus on here, okay? So if you need to pause to get those out of your packet, you may do so now, and make sure, of course, that you've got that pencil. I'm going to flip you around, and we will start off with taking our notes. All right, so again, this literary device that we're going to talk about today is hubris, and it's actually going to be something that we're going to take a look at as we start our very first book, which I know some of you are wondering, when will we start our first book? Soon. Tuesday, I think, Monday or Tuesday. So with that, here is our definition. Hubris is a character's excessive pride or arrogance that eventually brings about his downfall. Remember, fifth graders, if you're needing to pause in order to get caught up with note-taking, the video is yours to control. So this word excessive, that's a word that we use that means too much of something. So it's good to have pride in yourself, right? It's good to feel proud of the things that you've accomplished. But then there's this idea of excessive pride. If you think you're too great, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a second, but excessive, too much pride or too much arrogance. So that's kind of the first part of hubris, is this idea that there is a lot of pride, and then this idea that it leads to a downfall of some sort, okay? So a downfall potentially could be, a downfall could potentially be death, but it also could be maybe like losing a competition, or not having happiness in your relationships, or maybe really any kind of thing that you're trying to accomplish and then you fail at it could be the downfall, okay? So what does this mean, right? This excessive pride. Here's some ways to think about it. Hubris often results in a character overestimating his abilities, thinking he is superior to others, and believing that he is invincible or indestructible. Again, pause if you need to. So, to overestimate your abilities. Maybe you know that you have some sort of an ability, but if you overestimate it, it means you think like you go too far with it. So maybe you know, I'm a really great jumper. I'm like pretty awesome at jumping. And so then you overestimate your abilities and you think, I'm such a good jumper that I'm sure I could jump over the Grand Canyon. This would be an example of overestimating, right? To be a good jumper is great, but to think that you're such a great jumper that you could jump over the Grand Canyon, that's an overestimation, right? And frankly, it's probably going to lead to a downfall. There it is again, a downfall. If you try to jump over the Grand Canyon, it will lead to a downfall, literally. It just keeps coming. It's so good. So that's one thing, right? If you think that you're overestimating, okay? Thinking he is superior to others, right? So this idea that you're better than everybody else, right? And if you're better than everybody else, you don't really have to listen to the rules that other people have to listen to. You don't have to worry about the warnings that other people have to listen to. You think, that's just for regular people. That's not for me, okay? So that can expose you to a lot of danger. We're actually going to see this with one of our characters of our first book very soon. This believing that he is superior to others. And this finally is believing that he is invincible or indestructible. If you're invincible, that means that nothing can hurt you. Indestructible means nothing you could destroy you. So often characters show hubris by believing that nothing that they could do would ever harm them, that they will be fine. There's no way for them to be in danger, for them to be hurt, for them to be destroyed. Okay, so these are kind of three things we're looking at, and we're going to take a look at that as we're reading through today as well. So because the character believes that he cannot be destroyed, he will take foolish risks that lead to his downfall. And again, this could be temporary or it could be permanent. A permanent downfall could be death, but it could be, permanent injury of some sort or permanent loss of some sort. Temporary could be, just for a moment, right? There could be embarrassment that happens. That's a temporary downfall. Or maybe people are mad at you. That's a temporary downfall. Okay? So the downfall could come in a variety of forms. So by showing the main character's suffering as a result of their hubris, authors often use hubris to teach readers a lesson about avoiding hubris in their own lives. So when we think about this as a literary device, it's often the author's way of cautioning us, the readers, from our own hubris, saying, be careful, this is not something that we want to do in our lives. The ancient Greeks and ancient Romans really thought about hubris a lot. The Greeks in particular, this idea of hubris showed up often in ancient Greek literature, in their plays, in their teachings, okay? And so this is something else, again, I kind of touched on. It often acts as a theme in literature as well. It's a device that we'll look at, but also a lot of times in ancient literature, they're exploring this theme of hubris. So fifth graders, these notes should again go into the reading section of your white binder. If you need to pause to put them there, please do so now. And then we're going to move into actually working a little bit with our hubris. There we go. So fifth graders, as I mentioned, that story, we're going to be looking at a story, two stories, in fact, of Icarus and Narcissus. And as we're reading through, I want you to be looking for two parts, okay, of hubris. So first is, how does the character show hubris? So we kind of talked about three things. Do they overestimate their abilities? Do they think they're superior? Do they believe they're invincible? So we're going to try to identify which of these a character is showing with their hubris. And then the second part of it is going to be, what is the downfall? Remember, that's the second part of hubris. If there's hubris, they should show one of these types of behaviors, and then there should be a downfall. So as I'm reading, and remember, of course, if I'm reading aloud, your job is to have your eyes on the page. That's what's going to help you to become a better reader. As I'm reading, we should be thinking about these. And then when we're done with each story, we're going to stop and talk about them. So let's start with the story of Narcissus. Echo was one of the nymphs with whom Pan fell in love. She was a gay nymph who chattered and prattled all day long and never kept quiet long enough for Pan to win her with music and poetry. One day, Hera came down from Olympus to look for Zeus. She suspected that he was playing with the nymphs, but Echo detained her so long with idle chatter that Zeus, who really was there, was able to sneak away. Hera, in a rage, punished Echo by taking from her the gift of forming her own words. From then on, poor Echo could only repeat the words of others. So this is an interesting case, fifth graders, of how Echo, the only way she can talk is if someone says something, she can repeat them back. So if I said something like, hello there, Echo, all she could say back would be, hello there, Echo. And so now we use this word echo to mean that very thing, but this actually started with this story of ancient Greek mythology. Fascinating. Now at last Pan thought he could win her by his words, but before he had a chance, she had lost her heart to another. He was Narcissus, and he was so handsome that every girl and every nymph he met fell in love with him. Unfortunately, he liked nobody but himself. So, fifth graders, this is another example. If we talk about someone who is a narcissist or has narcissism, it's that they believe they actually are pretty much displaying hubris, right? There's the self-love and believing that they're better than everybody else. And this, again, comes from Narcissus. Echo trailed silently behind Narcissus as he hunted in the woods, hoping to hear an endearing word from him that she could repeat. But he never so much as noticed her. At last, toward nightfall, they came to a quiet pool, and as Narcissus was thirsty, he bent down to drink. Suddenly, he stopped and stared, for in the mirroring surface of the water, he saw the handsomest face he had ever seen. He smiled, and the handsome face smiled back at him. Joyfully he nodded, and so did the stranger in the water. So we have to be clear. What is Narcissus seeing? He bends over to look in, or to get a drink of water, and as he bends over to get a drink of water, he sees a face looking back at him. Whose face is he seeing looking back at him? Yeah, it's his own face. He's looking at his own reflection. And so he smiles, and the stranger, which is his reflection, smiles back at him. He nods, and the stranger, which is himself, nods back at him. I love you, said Narcissus to the handsome face. I love you, repeated Echo eagerly. She stood behind him, happy to be able to speak to him at last. But Narcissus neither saw nor heard her. He was spellbound by the handsome stranger in the water. He did not know that it was his own image that he had fallen in love with. And he sat smiling at himself, forgetting to eat, forgetting to drink, until he wasted away and died. Hermes came and led him down to the realm of the dead, but where he had been sitting, the lovely narcissus flower sprang up. Echo stood beside the flower and grieved and pined until she too faded away. Okay, so fifth graders, remember the first thing we're thinking about is how does the character show hubris? So first we want to think we have Echo and Narcissus. Which of those characters shows hubris? So that's right, we should be identifying Narcissus. And so the question is, does he overestimate his abilities? Does he think he's better than everybody else? Or does he believe that he's invincible? So what do you think? Which of those options seems best to apply to Narcissus? So I'm thinking of this second one, that he thinks he's superior to everyone else. Specifically, how? In what way does he think he's superior to everybody else? He really thinks that he's more handsome than anyone else, right? So handsome, he just stares at himself and smiles at himself and nods at himself and thinks he's pretty great, right? So we see that he thinks he's superior to others. So question 2 is, what is the downfall? What is Narcissus's downfall? Ultimately, he stares and smiles at himself so much that he forgets to eat and he ends up starving. That is definitely a downfall. So Narcissus showing hubris. All right, fifth graders, we're going to take a look at the story of Icarus. Both of these stories, by the way, start kind of in the middle of a bigger thing. So if it seems like we're jumping into the middle of a story, we are, okay? So we'll read this one together. King Minos was beside himself with fury when he discovered that his daughter had fled with the Athenians. He knew that no one but the brilliant Daedalus could have helped Theseus unravel the mystery of the labyrinth. So Daedalus was kept a prisoner in the palace and treated very harshly. Daedalus could not bear to be locked up and let his talents go to waste. Secretly, he made 2 sets of wings, 1 pair for himself and 1 pair for his son Icarus. They were cleverly fashioned of feathers set in beeswax. He showed his son how to use them and warned him not to fly too high or the heat of the sun would melt the wax. Then he led him up to the highest tower, and flapping their wings, they flew off like 2 birds. Neither King Minos nor Talos the robot could stop their flight. Young and foolish, Icarus could not resist the temptation to rise ever higher into the sky. The whole world seemed at his feet. He flew too close to the sun, and the wax began to melt. The feathers came loose, the wings fell apart, and Icarus plunged into the sea and drowned. Sadly, Daedalus flew on alone and came to the island of Sicily. His fame had flown ahead of him, and the king of Sicily welcomed him warmly, for he too wanted a splendid palace and bathrooms with running water. Okay, so again, we kind of have to figure out which character. We have Daedalus and Icarus, so which two of these seem to show hubris? So hopefully you're thinking of Icarus. So did Icarus overestimate his abilities? Did he think that he was superior? I didn't spell believe right. Goodness gracious, fifth graders. That should be an E. Did he think that he was superior to others, or did he believe that he was invincible? So as I'm thinking of these, I think there's probably two that make a lot of sense. So he gets these wings from his father that help him to fly, and he thinks he can fly, right? But then, and he can, right? But I think he does overestimate his abilities here, right? He thinks that he can fly higher than he really should be. He thinks he can get closer to the sun than he should. Okay, so I think you could say he overestimates his abilities, right? Quite literally, he's going higher, overestimating how high he can fly. Or I think you could say that he believes he's invincible. There's this belief that he doesn't have to worry about the warnings given to him because nothing's going to harm him. So I think either of those make a lot of sense. So then what? Here we go again, fifth graders. What is his downfall? I don't mean to laugh because it's serious, but it's also yet another prime example of seeing some literal humor in our work here, right? So what is the downfall? He flies too close to the sun and then he falls down, right? He falls down into the sea where he drowns. Okay, so we see hubris in both of these characters. So to refresh our memories, right, as we're looking at hubris, fifth graders, we're talking about when a character shows excessive pride, like too much pride, too much arrogance, that eventually leads to a downfall of some sort. In our stories today, the downfall was death, but that's not always going to be the case when we're looking at characters. They won't always have a downfall. So, to be clear, again, as we're wrapping up fifth graders, we have our test. That test is tomorrow. We have our study guide. So your job is to study and make sure that you are ready to show me what you know on tomorrow's test. So good luck, fifth graders. If you have questions, of course, reach out and let me know.